topics, the defense of the free world. And of course, we have also very interesting guests. If you can follow us on X and also subscribe us on YouTube and also on Instagram, on LinkedIn, we are on all channels, and we are doing what we can in the defense of the free world. And tonight we have a very special guest, a famous Canadian journalist with Serbian background. So a lot of interesting topics to cover with Adam. I'm very happy that you're here, and we want to learn about Canada. We want to learn about your background and about your relation with the United States.
Sure.
And we want to learn about you. Thanks a lot, Adam, for coming to the show. Please, can you introduce yourself?
Thank you for having me. So I am a Canadian political columnist. I write for the National Post, which is one of our two national newspapers. It's the largest conservative paper in Canada. I'm a center-right writer, but in the American context, that basically means that I would be a corporate Democrat. So I'm the kind of guy who votes conservative in the Canadian context, supports Kamala, supported Kamala last year, and would maybe, if I were American, vote for the Republicans in the future if they became a bit more normal. But very much kind of in the political center to center right. Now, I'm also...
We see the world very similar in many things. Yeah, actually very interesting to meet you, Adam. I'm happy for this conversation.
Yeah, and there's a certain political homelessness that comes with this as well, at least in the international context. Now, I'm also a reporter for the News Forum, which is a smaller national TV channel in Canada. And so they have sent me to Israel to cover the potential war with Iran. So I'm currently in Tel Aviv. And outside of that, I'm also the de facto Ukraine correspondent for the National Post. I went to go report in Ukraine at the very beginning of the war, met this wonderful man who became my fiance. And now I spend half of my time in Ukraine, half of my time in Canada. I go to Israel. I'm always in all the fun places.
That's amazing. I don't really know which hot topic to start with when you are in Ukraine, in Israel at the moment. We maybe have to start with that one a bit, yeah? Because it's the most burning issue. Will the strike be tonight, or what's going on?
That's the thing. So no one knows for sure. And there's a great deal of uncertainty, which is totally normal. That being said, there is this sense that the strike will likely happen this weekend, but at the same time, making predictions is always dangerous because you could very easily end up with egg on your face. Mm-hmm. But I personally feel a sense of anxiety that I haven't felt, over the past week, because I arrived here about a week, ago, just to ensure that I'm here before the airspace closes. But at this point, I'm starting to feel like, okay, this weekend there could be this war. Now, the mood in Tel Aviv, at least, is fairly relaxed. I've interviewed a large number of Israelis here, and for many of them, they say that years of war have inoculated them against panic. And it's almost like a video game in a sense, where you're going from a boss to a harder boss to a harder boss, right? So in the beginning, it was October 7th, there was Hamas. Hamas was, did a terrible atrocity, but they were fairly easy to pacify. Difficult to eradicate, but easy to pacify. Then came Hezbollah, which was a bit more of a formidable opponent. And then you had Iran last year. Now you have Iran again. And so the level of risk to, let's say, residents of Tel Aviv has been going up incrementally. But what that means is it gives people the ability to slowly acclimate to larger risks. And so at this point, the Israelis who I've spoken with said, hey, you know what? Maybe we'll have ballistic missiles landing in this city. But we had that last year. And we went through that, and it was fine. And they know what to expect. Now, one thing I want to emphasize to anyone listening is that Israel is fairly unique in that its infrastructure is built with war in mind. Since the early 90s, every single building needs to have a shelter. Every apartment building needs to have a reinforced room, which is called a mamad, which is separate from the shelter. And it's illegal to deny anyone access to a shelter. And so what that means is that you have a lot of agency over your own safety. If there are missiles landing in the city, you go to your mamad, or you go to a public shelter or a basement shelter, and these things are heavily reinforced. So they're borderline impregnable. Now, of course, they're not going to protect you if a ballistic missile lands directly on your shelter. At a certain point, there's just nothing you can do. But at that point, you're just maybe a little bit unlucky, right? Statistically speaking, you are more likely to die from being hit by a car at least in recent wars. Maybe that will change for this particular war. And that gives people a sense of calmness.
Adam, I was in 98 in Israel when Saddam Hussein was throwing some Scud missiles. Yeah, that's historic times. But then I was with one family, a friend of mine, Aaron Cohen, and he simply said, Günther, relax, we have a bunker for you and you will survive. And then luckily nothing happened. But the Israelis are really accustomed to that one. And the threat of Iranian retaliation, I think, will not shy them away from supporting the American liberation of Iran, which I hope is happening now.
Yeah, the thing is that they see this as a necessity. And so no one wants to be in war. No one wants to have their cities bombed. But at the same time, they say that if it doesn't happen now, then it will have to happen in the future. And it's better to get it over with at this point rather than risk having the Iranian regime further consolidate its power, right? And also, they know the protocols, right? So as you said, when you were there, they said just go to the bunker. So when I was in Israel last summer for the 12-day war, I was stunned by how well organized everything was. So first, you receive a pre-warning on your phone, and that is a warning that comes to every phone. It's mandatory. It's like an emergency or Amber Alert, and then that warning tells you to go near a safe place, to go near a shelter, but you don't necessarily have to be in the shelter. Then you get a second warning. And at that point, you have about 90 seconds to get inside the shelter because the missile has been launched. And so, as long as you follow the pre warning, you're pretty much okay. And compared to Ukraine, for example, I feel much safer even if the ballistic missiles landing in this area that were landing in this area last summer and could land again this upcoming week, were quite formidable.
Tell me about the public opinion in Canada. Will they support regime change in Iran now and the liberation, or will it be like a Iraq-style anti-American mood, which we have seen 20 years ago?
So, awareness of the Iranian cause was lacking until very recently. And it changed a lot since January because we have a large Iranian diaspora. We have hundreds of thousands of Iranians, and they began to protest in early January. And initially, their protests were somewhat ignored by the mainstream media because, I mean, I'm going to be very blunt, many journalists tend to be a bit more on the progressive side, and they can be biased here, and they're not always interested in international human rights when the oppressed group here is protesting for secular democracy and against radical Islamism, right? When you have people who are protesting for American power. And Iranians were very angry in January because they thought that our national broadcaster was ignoring them. Most of our newspapers were ignoring them.
Same in Austria, by the way. Same in Austria, really.
It happens. But what they did is rather than just complain about it, they took things into their own hands and they organized these enormous demonstrations that grew week after week. And so on February 2nd, there was a demonstration that attracted about, I think, 150,000, 200,000 people in Toronto,
Wow.
Which was huge. That was pretty much one of the largest demonstrations that we had seen in the city in history. And at that point, it was impossible for the media to ignore this. And then 2 weeks afterwards, there was another demonstration that brought about 350,000 people. And that seems to be the largest political demonstration in the history of the city. And whereas the media initially misrepresented what the Iranians wanted, they first just kind of said, they're protesting the regime. And they whitewashed the fact that Iranians want military intervention. After the 350,000 person protest, they realized they couldn't do this anymore. And media coverage began to mention the need or the desire for military intervention and regime change. So people are now on board. And it also helps that the Iranians have been very smart with their messaging. And I don't mean that it's all strategic. They're just a lovely community. And so whereas over the past 2 years, we've had many of these pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas protests that are very aggressive and often disrespectful towards Canadians. These are the kind of protests where people say the West is evil, Canada is an illegitimate state, they burn Canadian flags, they hate everyone else. The Persians have been totally different. So from the very beginning, they emphasized patriotism. So there were always Canadian flags everywhere at these events. They would stop and sing the Canadian national anthem. And rather than shouting at police officers and vilifying them, you would have Iranian protesters come and give them flowers. So at these protests, I would see police cars covered in flowers. And so this charmed many Canadians. And rather than just see this, it's another diaspora group that is complaining about their problems back home, everyone loved the Iranians. They're the perfect example of what an immigrant group should be. And so there's a great deal of goodwill and desire for them to be free.
In Austria, we even had the first parliamentarian from the Conservative Party openly calling on the demonstration for regime change, Andreas Minich. That was a real change because we Austrians, as a neutral country, was always very reluctant for such military interventions. But now I think the public mood has shifted towards regime change in Europe, especially because of the dramatic killings on the 8th of January, which was so horrendous. What was your perception of that killing? What's your information as a journalist? What news did you get out of Iran in the last 6 weeks since this disaster?
Well, I haven't received any information that's special. Anything that I've seen is stuff that's available to anyone else. But what I can say is that it dramatically changed the perceptions of Iran. So whereas before everyone knew, at least abstractly, that the Iranian regime, the Islamic regime, was terrible, when they realized that tens of thousands of protesters were murdered just like this in an event that was several times worse than Tiananmen Square, I think that there was an understanding that, wait a second, this situation is untenable and that there needs to be some kind of change. So the Iranian regime was able to suppress domestic dissent, but at the same time consolidated international opposition to their continued existence.
There's also a big link between Iran and Russia, obviously. They are basically part of the same axis of evil, and they have supported the Russian war against Ukraine intensively with these infamous Shahid drones. Do you see that regime change in Iran will also help the Ukrainians in their struggle for freedom?
Partially, but not as much as you would think. So, and I want to say as a funny story that, when I'm in Tel Aviv, when I was during the 12-day war, I thought to myself, oh my God, Iranian drones exploding over my head. Groundbreaking. We've all been there before after Ukraine. But when Iran assisted Russia, it was a much larger player at the beginning of the war. So Iran began to supply Shahed drones /Shahid drones to Russia in late 2022 and was a major supplier up until early to mid 2023. But then Russia took this technology, improved it, and started its own domestic production. And so at this point, Russian domestic production far outstrips anything that the Iranians are able to provide. We know, for example, that let's say in early 2024, in 2024, the Russians were sending about 500 drones every month, and then that increased by a factor of 10, right? So now we have thousands of drones that are sent into Ukrainian cities every single month, and those are all, the vast majority of those are Russian produced. So because of this, if Iran does get knocked out, I don't think that that's going to make a huge dent to Russia's war efforts, but we'll see. I mean, I'm also not carefully tracking what other forms of support they do provide. Now, one thing I do want to emphasize is that people believe that, okay, if the regime does fall, they imagine that the successor government will be some big American cheerleader. But that's not necessarily going to be the case. I mean, Reza Pahlavi, who is the exiled Iranian crown prince, who wants to, lead a transitional government, who is very, very, very popular in diaspora and seemingly popular within Iran itself. He wrote a transition plan with the help of Iranian civil society actors over the course of the past 2 to 3 years. That transition plan is the reason why many Iranians who were skeptical of him have come on side to support him. And I wrote an article about that transition plan and about his foreign policy. So his vision for a post-Islamic regime Iran is one where Iran focuses on non-interference and maintaining its territorial integrity and sovereignty, right? Now, Pahlavi wants to normalize relations with Israel. He wants to build a close relationship with the EU. He wants to stop any funding for terrorism in the region, which is great. That's really lovely for the West. But at the same time, he emphasizes that he wants to have respectful and mutually constructive relationships with China and Russia. And there are some Westerners who say, "Oh, that's terrible," but it's the pragmatic thing to do here in this situation, because the problem with Iran is that you don't want it to dissolve into sectarian violence. And Iran is not Iraq. It has a long history of existing as as a distinct territorial unit, as a distinct nation. But Iran is also not just composed of Persians. You have Kurds, you have Azerbaijanis, you have other ethnic groups. And so any collapse of the Islamic regime would lead to a period of instability, right? And so Pahlavi would have to focus on, for example, removing any fifth columns from his governments, of pacifying any potential rebels within the country. And during this transition period, stabilization period, which would last about 1 or 2 years, according to Pahlavi's plan, obviously you do not want China and Russia to destabilize the country. And so Iran, or at least Pahlavi, he wants to play nice with everyone to make sure that Iran does not collapse and is not dismembered. So don't expect, Iran to suddenly come to the West's aid. They need to fix their own shit.
And Adam, tell me, your own plans, you will stay in Israel during the war when it's coming, or you will move closer to the arena if it's possible?
It depends. So I came here specifically to report on the war. And so should it begin, I will be in Tel Aviv. So I'm where the action is. And so I can get the stories of, what happened, and go to the places that have been bombed, assuming that, you're allowed to report on all the places. Some places you're not allowed to report on. But should the situation get too spicy, too dangerous, then I could relocate to, for example, a friend's place that is outside of the city. It all depends on how effectively the United States is able to cripple the Iranian regime, how many missiles land in Tel Aviv, and how many interceptor missiles stay within the stockpile here. Because once they begin to run out, then it gets much more dangerous.
You're a courageous man to go to the arena, to the front lines of the confrontation with Iran at the moment. I want to ask you now about Ukraine. You have been several times in Ukraine, and you are also covering the war in Ukraine. How Canada is one of the key supporters for Ukraine. You have a huge Ukrainian diaspora. You famously had a lot of Canadians, actually, of Ukrainian descent in the last 100 years. How strong is your support and your backing for Ukraine in Canada? And what's your take on the war of Russia against Ukraine?
So I'm going to cover the Canadian angle first before going into the rest of Ukraine. So Canada is a stalwart supporter of Ukraine. Obviously, we do have some Ukraine skeptics, but that problem is much less severe than it is in the United States. And part of it comes from the fact that, us existing beside the United States, our information spheres are very intermeshed. So there's a lot of American media that makes its way to Canada and then poisons people's opinions against Ukraine. But for the most part, people are very pro-Ukrainian. The Conservative Party here understands, at least I get the sense that they understand, that being anti-Ukrainian is political poison, especially because the main liability for the Conservative Party here is any association with Trumpism, right? Because Trump's annexationist talks are very unpopular for obvious reasons. And so the liberals who are currently in government keep on saying the conservatives are MAGA, the conservatives are MAGA. So the conservatives obviously don't want to reinforce that perception by being anti-Ukraine. Plus also many of our Ukrainians, they live in West Canada, which is where the conservatives are strongest. So conservative parliamentarians have many Ukrainians as constituents, right? So we are partially inoculated from the anti-Ukrainian right. And also, in our media sphere, people are very pro-Ukrainian. The National Post is very pro-Ukrainian. We're the biggest conservative paper. I think that I contributed to that because, I went to Ukraine. And so the editors, they all followed my Twitter. They could see that there were no Nazis and all this stuff. And they read all my op-eds. So that's great. But there is a fatigue. There's a fatigue. And the fatigue is because Canada is economically malaised right now. So we are in a period of prolonged stagnation. Our GDP per capita barely grew since 2015. There is a general sense that the quality of life in Canada is declining and that we are in too much debt. And in a situation like this, the big question is, what's in it for us? Why does it matter? So on my end, I tend to emphasize the fact that for Canada, our main security risk going forward in the medium term is our Arctic sovereignty. So with the Arctic now melting and becoming an arena, a political and military arena, our land up there is much more vulnerable. We've never really exercised strong control there, but it never mattered because no one cared because there was nothing really valuable there. That's changing. And so I make the argument to people quite often that, look, this may not seem relevant to Canadian interests right now, but it would make sense for us to support Ukraine on top of the moral case. The moral case is assumed, but from a strategic standpoint, it would make sense for us to support Ukraine to help cripple Russia, to give us more time to fortify our Arctic, and to ensure that Russia is a weaker adversary in the Arctic going forward. That plays well. I've also argued that because the Canadian military has been chronically underfunded and we're very weak, a lot of our stuff doesn't work, it would make sense for us to partner with Ukraine to provide funding for their drones, but to, in exchange, have these drones, for example, partially manufactured in Canada so we can have a technology transfer, so we can know how to cheaply modernize our military capabilities. The problem with that, though, is that from my understanding, our defense companies want to monopolize procurements. So, getting them to produce drones is difficult because they're inefficient and slow. And it's hard to rely on smaller manufacturers like Ukraine does because they're locked out. Now, just to finish the point, what we'll see here is that these are strategic arguments that really point to Canadian self-interest. Unfortunately, and I understand why, Canada has often framed its support for Ukraine from a moral standpoint. And morality is great. I mean, morality gets people excited, but people are fickle and they get excited by the next thing. And if you just rely on the moral humanitarian case, people are going to lose interest over time. So I feel like for the Canadian government, they're misplaying this a little bit because they're not making the case to Canadians about why it benefits us in terms of our self-interest to do that, to support Ukraine.
And, in terms of military and financial support, there was some criticism that Canada is a very rich country and very strong country, and it has supported, of course, Ukraine. But do you think it was enough? Do you think it was adequate? What's your take on the support levels of Canada for Ukraine in the last 4 years?
We could have and should have done more, but I think the assistance that we could have provided would have been financial. We don't have a lot of material to send in terms of arms. And I'm going to use a very famous example. So in late 2022 or early 2023, there was this big push to provide Ukraine with tanks for its counteroffensive, which ultimately failed. And Canada gave 4 tanks, just 4 tanks, 4 Leopard 2 tanks.
4.
Yeah.
That's really not a lot.
Yeah. Well, so then I looked into it and I thought, why do we give so few tanks? What's wrong here? So I found 2 military essays that had been published from some military academy. Was not classified, which was great. And so it turns out that, Canada had a Leopard 1 fleet from I think the 70s or 80s, old stuff that's kind of useless. And then they purchased Leopard 2 tanks in the 2000s because they wanted to show the United States that they were serious about assisting with the war in Iraq. And so we bought 80 Leopard 2 tanks, and we essentially assumed that the amount of maintenance needed for a Leopard 2 tank would be roughly equivalent of what you would need for a Leopard 1 tank. That assumption was not correct. You need 6 times more hours to maintain a Leopard 2 than a Leopard 1, so we didn't have the maintenance capacity. And so eventually we put those tanks in storage in the early 2010s, and we couldn't maintain them. So over time, many of them became derelict and defunct. And so by the late 2010s, early 2020s, only about a quarter of them or 20 to 30 of them, if I remember correctly, were operational. and many of the tanks have been cannibalized to keep the other ones working. And we had our NATO commitments in Latvia, I think, somewhere in the Baltics. So we couldn't provide more than 4 tanks while maintaining enough of a fleet to maintain our basic commitments to the Baltics. And the underlying point here is that our military is so dysfunctional, our kit is so broken and disregarded, and in such disrepair that we can barely aid Ukraine. So I think we did the best that we could in terms of weapons, but financially we could have done more.
Yeah, I think we are now a little bit, cut. America has stopped the support, and we have our problems with Hungary, but we have at least put another 90 billion euros for Ukraine, and anybody who can ship in. As far as I know, Canada is one of the richest countries in the world. So maybe to help us a bit, because we want Ukraine to stay financially strong enough to liberate Crimea and to regain all the territory. And for this, we need the resources to get it done. So nevertheless, thanks for Canada for the support. Let's discuss a little bit Greenland, yeah? Because you talk about Arctic security. President Trump was a little bit ambitious and tried to take us our Danish European island, Greenland. What is the Canadian perception of such bullying?
It's exactly what you would imagine it to be. We're confused, we're shocked, we're angry, we feel anxious. There's a big question about whether or not Trump is serious. Some people thought that he was just joking and trolling us at the very beginning. And then over time, as you continue making these jokes, people began to wonder, well, what exactly is going on here? He doesn't seem mentally stable. And so overwhelmingly, most Canadians despise Trump, despise this Greenland push. There is a well of support for Trump amongst Canadian conservatives, but it's only about, I think, 45% of the party, which is a lot. But when when the Conservative Party, only has half of conservatives supporting Trump, then that's good, I think, on my end. That it's still a tiny portion of society. The annexationist talks have caused a lot of economic anxiety. It's created some pain in our economy. So Canadians have very much soured on the United States. We thought that we were friends, but that allyship it's in the garbage now. But the question is, how do we respond to this? And so obviously we need to diversify our trade relations. We need to be less dependent on the United States. I think
The Economist has published a wonderful theory that Canada might join the European Union. And by the way, you are very welcome. So is there a real debate about that, or is this an option? Do you like us?
I mean, look, I don't think that anyone's actually considering that here. It's a fantastical idea. It's very abstract. But what we are doing right now, and this is what I don't agree with, is that we are trying to manage our risk with the United States by pivoting to China. And yeah, it's not
bad.
So what Mark Carney, our prime minister, did is that he announced a comprehensive strategic partnership with China a few weeks ago. And so he went there and he basically said, we're going to reset our relationship with China. We're going to have visa-free travel to China. We're going to allow for media partnerships. So now China's state media can advertise in Canadian spaces, right? They started with some tariff reduction, but the idea is that this is going to be a comprehensive economic relationship. And while I understand that there is a need for us to decouple from the United States to a certain degree, this is just replacing one bully with another. We know that China uses economic coercion very easily, very quickly to punish countries that it perceived as being disobedient. We saw that with Australia in the early 2020s. We saw that, I think it was with Lithuania as well. One of the Baltic states recognized Taiwan, and then that was a whole clusterfuck. Yeah. So I don't understand why Carney and the Liberals have such a romantic view of China here. And this is where many conservatives are concerned, because we're wary of the United States, but Beijing is not a good alternative.
We really in Europe, many people would love Canada to join the European Union. It would be like economic, a perfect match with your resources and your entrepreneurship spirit, and it would really be a punch in the face of Trump. So you are very welcome. At least to deepen our association, I think we are already, since the CETA agreement, very deeply integrated, and there is many opportunities now. Iceland wants to join the European Union, and I hope Norway will come as well. One day maybe the UK will come back again, and there it would help a lot if in Canada maybe some op-eds on your side with this maybe fantastic idea. You would be very famous because this article has really reached a lot of European opinion makers in the Economist last year when they published this idea. And why not? It's not a geographic idea, Europe. It's a value union, and it's at least an option to be taken serious.
I mean, look, it would be a lovely idea. I would love to have visa-free travel throughout Europe, for example,
Yes,
and to be able to work in Europe and live in Europe easily as an
yes,
EU member.
that's included in the deal.
Yeah, but it seems to many Canadians like this doesn't seem like a realistic proposal to us, at least from what
It's
I hear.
better than working with China. I think we can speak English not very well, like me, but it's still better than Chinese. Yeah? So ultimately, and we would
Yeah,
love to have you. Let
I
me
mean,
ask you about the US Canadian relation. Obviously, this is now a big issue, and it has also party political connotations, as I understand, because logically, after Justin Trudeau, there should have been a change towards the Conservatives in Canada, but it all didn't work out so well because Trump's unpopularity and his constant Canada bashing. What's really going on in your bilateral, natural friendship? Normally, it should be the best harmony between Canada and the US, at least from our European perspective. But unfortunately, Trump is putting these crazy ideas like Canada joining the United States as a 51st state. Not even he gives you not even the honor that all your states would join as separate states, but he wants to minuscule you as one small state. And it's really very outrageous, and I feel very sorry for that. But what exactly is the current status of affairs between Canada and the US?
uh, quite bitter, to be honest. But I want to clarify that there has always been some tension between the United States and Canada. Canadians don't really have a strong sense of national identity. That's something that's been noted since the 1950s, 1960s. Once we separated ourselves from Britain, we weren't able to really identify who we are to define ourselves. And unlike, in order for someone to have a national identity, you need strong national myths. For example, the United States has the American Revolution, right? That helps anchor their sense of identity. But for us, we were given independence in a piecemeal basis, so bit by bit, and we never really fought for this independence. So we don't have any dramatic myths from the past that we can use to anchor our sense of history and our sense of collective destiny. And we're also very culturally similar to the United States. So Canadian nationalism, has always been very, very thin. Maybe hockey and Tim Hortons, which is a restaurant chain, but we've often identified ourselves by not being American. And so we say we are Canadian because we are not them. And that's a negative sense of identity, which is not stable. But what that means is that for Canada, there's often been a sense of condescension towards the United States. We look down upon them, but it's a condescension which is also rooted in jealousy because they have more money than us, they have more opportunity, they have more clout. So there's that. But we also have a more stable political system, right? We don't have the insanity that we see there. Um, in contrast, the United States doesn't really think about us that often. We're like a little annoying brother to them, who knows, maybe a cousin. But they do, many American policymakers have felt a sense of resentment because we haven't really met our commitments, right? So we mooched off the United States when it came to NATO for many, many years. And the American policymakers said, well, you have to spend more, you have to spend more, you have to spend more. And we said, sure, okay, maybe eventually. Oh, I'm busy. I'll see you next week. See you in a few years from now. But we didn't follow through. And so now we don't really have a functional military, and the U.S. was resentful. So some of these existing tensions are very important for understanding current relations because there is anger, but that anger is not something that came out of thin air. It's a amplification of pre-existing concerns.
Good. And what's your hope for the conservatives to recover from this crisis and the lost elections? I understand it was the Trump factor which cost the conservatives the elections. What do you think? Is there an option for recovery in the next elections, or will you be permanently run by the Liberal Party?
Right now, the situation is difficult for the conservatives. So it's not just Trump that cost us the election. It's also the replacement of Trudeau with Mark Carney. Trudeau, by the end of his term, was widely despised and was not respected by many progressives as well. He was an unserious leader who prioritized political theater over substantive governance. He's the kind of guy who liked getting selfies, but didn't pay too much attention to the details of policymaking. And Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party, was very effective at positioning himself as Trudeau's antithesis, saying, Trudeau bad, Trudeau bad, Trudeau bad, Trudeau frivolous, conservatives will not be like Trudeau. So then, in January slash December of about a year ago, Trudeau resigned, and he prorogued Parliament. So Parliament was basically out of session while the Liberals could get their new leader, and he was replaced with Mark Carney. Mark Carney is a much more serious leader. I'm not a Liberal. I still respect Carney. He's obviously intelligent. He is a serious man. He speaks like a real human being, and he's much more practical than Trudeau. And I know from my circles personally, and this is just anecdotal, I know people who say, yeah, Trudeau was an idiot, but I respect Carney and I will vote Liberal because I like Carney. Poilievre didn't do enough to condemn Trump's messages at the very beginning. I think part of the reason was that they were concerned that this would distract from the law and order and affordability messaging that the conservatives were so good on. They kind of saw this as a distraction, and they underappreciated how much of a factor this would be. But they also didn't pivot to identifying, Carney's weaknesses. And so during that election, Poilievre was kind of still fixated on Trudeau, even though Trudeau very quickly became yesterday's man. And that also amplified his problems here. Now, another element, which is not well understood by people outside of Canada, is that we have, we're a multi-party system. And we have four main parties, the Liberals, the Conservatives, the NDP, which is our far left party, and the Bloc Québécois, which is a regional party for Quebec. The NDP historically have gotten about 19% of the votes, and they split the votes for the progressives, right? Whereas the Conservatives and Liberals would get about 32% of the vote. Now, the NDP fared terribly in the last election for two main reasons. So their leader, who has since resigned, Jagmeet Singh, was basically, he was like a cringy millennial type progressive leader who did TikToks in a shower, who, prioritized really woke politics that didn't speak to many Canadians, especially in a time of crisis and in a time of economic crisis. And many working class voters were turned off. If you are a blue collar worker in, let's say, a small town in Ontario, and the NDP, which you've historically supported, is now only talking about how we have to uplift women and non-binary people, and talking about, racial issues all the time without talking about class. And you see the leader, wearing, he loved Versace. He always dressed in designer clothing. You see someone like that making TikToks, you're not going to vote for him. So when people saw Carney come in, who was much more serious, there was a mass defection. And so the NDP vote collapsed to about, I think, 6% or so, maybe 7%. And so about 12% of the voters migrated to the Liberals and helped them win the election. So the Conservatives actually got their highest vote share in recent history. They got about, I think, 40% of the votes, which is something that we haven't seen in generations. But they lost because the NDP collapsed and there was a consolidation of the left-wing vote, which was normally split.
Thanks for the explanation. Interesting. The point is with Carney, he is very well received since his speech in Davos. Yeah, when he called that we have to tear down the statues of the past, and he has quoted Václav Havel, that all these beliefs from the past must be changed. But what really has it changed for Canada and the world? He said that the old world order is dead, and he went immediately to China to make a deal with the communists of China. So I cannot really see his beautiful new world order, which he is somehow building with the communists of China. So what is really his ideological core? What he can offer by signed nice speeches and the Chinese deals?
Well, I mean, he is, anti-American. He does want to diversify Canada's trade relations. I just I think that the way that he's handled it has not been overly not too wise, because if you want to protect your country, you have to show a degree of cunning, right? And if you want to diversify from your largest trading partner, you shouldn't antagonize them so brazenly until you've decoupled a bit, right? The United States is still by a huge margin our biggest trading partner, so it's not wise for us to be making speeches in Davos basically insinuating that the United States is evil. Um, we can think these things. We can think that Trump is a destructive person, but it's better for us to be quieter and diplomatic and to maneuver behind the scenes and uh, to shift our relations without drawing too much attention. We know, for example, that China did a very good job over the past few decades of manipulating its way into power and acting with subtlety. So I wish that Carney would show a bit more subtlety and acumen when it comes to navigating these difficult times.
I think it's a big opening for your conservative leader to come closer to the European Union, to visit Berlin and to visit Brussels, and to really build a much stronger alliance with the Europeans. Because we see Trump's America exactly like you. We want to have good relations with the United States. We are dependent on the United States. We need them for defense, security, prosperity. But of course, Trump is a disaster. And so we could build a very good alliance with Canada, and no need to run to Beijing to find new allies when you have us on the old continent. And we also have 20 trillion GDP as an economy, and we are very friendly to Canada.
I broadly agree with that, but I think that Europe has an image problem amongst conservative Canadians. It's so, I mean, Europe can be perceived as being overly bureaucratic, um, not sufficiently respectful of free speech, and there's skepticism about the migrant problem, right? I mean, we see all the news about the internal social unrest and racial strife within Western Europe, and so I think
There
some.
is no social strife in Western Europe. This is Elon Musk portraying us like JD Vance. I know every country in Europe, and I know Europe very well, as you do as well. But this kind of misperception of Europe as in chaos is also in Canada so strong. It's really sad.
I mean, that is the perception. Yeah.
I mean, really, we are one of the richest and securest and nicest places in the world. I can testify that in Vienna. Really, you cannot find a better place to live than Germany, Austria, and there's certainly no chaos on the streets. And the last time I looked, we were one of the richest countries in the world. Okay, Canada is also a good place. I don't want to talk negatively, but let's be very honest. We are very far away from the picture Elon and JD is portraying us. It's a complete persiflage of the reality of
I mean,
Europe.
you're the European, so I don't want to. I mean, I'm just an outsider here, but I know, for example, in Ukraine, we do have Ukrainian refugees who do come back to Ukraine because they're concerned about the lack of public safety that they see in some European cities. So I've had European refugees who've said, yeah, they came back to Odessa, a city that's being bombed, because they felt unsafe, for example, in northern France, with all of the crime that they were witnessing. Um, so I don't think it's this perception of there being social strife in Western Europe. It's not just like it's something that we see in Canada, but it's something we see in Eastern Europe as well. When I'm in Ukraine, when I'm in Serbia, we look at what's happening in Western Europe and we say, there seems to be problems here. But at the same time, you're the European, you're in Vienna.
It's always good. It's always good to bash the French. It's always a good denominator.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, really seriously, Europe is just fine, and we can do many things together with Canada. And first of all, secure and help Ukraine, and also help the Americans to regime change Iran and build a much better, richer West together. I think there's wonderful opportunities here, and we would like to see the Prime Minister and the opposition leader in Brussels very soon,
Mhm.
and to intensify our agreement in trade, which we have successfully. It's actually a very well working free trade agreement, which we, after a lot of acrimony, have signed, I think, in 2016 or 17. Luckily, that was a very good thing to do.
Mhm.
We are
Well,
happy.
I also hope for closer relations between Europe and Canada, but we'll see what happens.
Adam, you told me in the pre-discussion that you have Serbian roots, and you are also very active in the Balkans, as I understand, or you were even in the protests last year in the Blockada students. Tell me about your background.
Yeah, so I'm ethnically Serbian. I was born and raised in Canada, and I didn't really pay too much attention to my Serbian heritage when I was younger, but that began to change in the 2010s because Canada became a post-national state. That's what our bureaucratic elites decided. And in a post-national state, it's hard to feel a sense of belonging. So I ended up gravitating to my heritage, seeing my family more often, and of course, being based in Ukraine made it easier for me to go to Serbia more often. So my relationship with the country is, I mean, it's been there for a while, but it's only recently been renewed. And so I was there last year in March to cover the anti-government student protests. So to give just a summary of what happened, at the end of 2024, there was a new train station that collapsed and killed about, I think, 15, 16, 17 people. And uh, actually going back just a bit further, so there is a high-speed rail line that is being built across the Balkans, and eventually it's supposed to connect Budapest to Athens, and this is being built by the Chinese. It's their way of kind of building their influence in the Balkans. And the first line was first part of the line was between Novi Sad, which is Serbia's second largest city of 300,000 people, and Belgrade, which is about 1.2 million people. And construction began in the late 2010s. There was, of course, some corruption there. That's just how Serbia is. And eventually opened in the early 2020s. And it was seen as a huge point of national pride that symbolized Serbia's economic and physical renewal. Seeing infrastructure like this open, knowing that you can go to Novi Sad in 35 minutes instead of an hour and a half. And people would just take the train for fun, right? So the line opened, but the Novi Sad station renovation took some time. And it opened up in the summer of 2024. And then a few months later, a concrete canopy in front of the station collapsed, killing all of those people. And that raised questions about whether corruption had led to this, to inadequate renovations and killed all these Serbs. And it was symbolic because everyone had passed through that station, right? So it could have been you, right? It could have been anyone from the Serbian perspective. So some Serbian students began to protest, and the regime in Serbia reacted as it always does. So suddenly, masked men showed up and beat the student protesters. Masked men who definitely had nothing to do with the government, right?
That's
We
how
know.
Vucic does the things.
Yeah, I mean, this is how Vucic works. So this is how this is how the Balkans work. And then that, of course, really offended many Serbians, and the protest only grew from there. You had all these student strikes, and by December, you had massive protests in Belgrade. Then January, February, things quiet down for a bit, and the Serbian students began to walk from city to city. So, and this essentially put them in close contact with everyday Serbians. And many older Serbians, especially in rural areas, they don't have access to independent information because the cable networks, the broadcasters, essentially that like hold all these channels, they're controlled by the government and they don't offer opposition channels. So if you're an old woman in some random village, you don't have access to opposition channels. You only have access to state control channels, and they only show pro-Putin propaganda, pro-Vucic propaganda. you're not going to be overly sympathetic to the students, but then the students walk through your village, right? And then you see them. So this built their support. And bikers, like biker gangs, began to provide security for the students to protect them against mass thugs, which was great. These were not like criminal bikers, these were just like big guys that like riding on motorcycles. So there was this mass support. And then in March, the there were about 300,000 Serbian protesters in Beograd, which is insane, right? This is a city, this is a country of what, 7 million people. So almost 4 or 5% of the population was there protesting, and then Vucic used a sound cannon to cause chaos. I arrived shortly afterwards because I thought this was important, and I got to see like my family, which was great. Um, and so around this time, there was this encampment of pro Vucic students that showed up out of nowhere. They set up their encampment across from Parliament, and then all of a sudden, police began to protect them and keep anyone from going inside. And it was surrounded by fencing. So we all knew that right away that this was all fake. This is, a government organized psychological operation. So I decided to show up at the encampments, and I just played dumb. And I was like, la di da di da, I'm just a dumb Canadian. What? Do you speak English? I can understand Serbian. I can speak a little bit of it. So they didn't know I could understand them. And I just pretended to be really ignorant. And I went inside. And then they were freaking out because, like, oh, an international journalist is here. And so I interviewed some of them. And they gave me the most ridiculous thing. They were telling me, oh, the students are having gay orgies in their in their uh, in their protests. So I called my cousin, who is in the protest, and I said, "Cousin, why didn't you tell me that you were having all these gay orgies?" Um, and
But
then by the
lucky
end,
that you were a Canadian journalist because they can be dangerous as well. They have beaten up one of the opposition leaders last year, Sandulovic, just because he was not convenient, and then they was hospitalized. This
well,
kind of
this is what they do. So then I was recording, like I took some photos around, and most of the people in the encampment, first of all, the encampment was half empty. Then most of the people there were old, like they were in their 30s, 40s. They looked like bad people, like criminals. And then there were some youth who just kind of looked lost and like they were in a bad space, but mostly delinquents. And so then I took a shot at part of the camp, and then one of the guys, like one, I guess, enforcer was in the background, way in the background. He freaked out. He ran up to me screaming, how, like, what the fuck am I doing? Why did I take a photo of him? Yada yada yada. It was all in Serbian. I almost responded in Serbian, and then I realized, wait, no, 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 no. Stay
better
here.
not.
So I just looked at him and was like, "Do you speak English?" She was got so mad. Um, and then the leader of the encampment went there, and they were arguing in Serbian, and I had to pretend not to understand. But the enforcer basically said that he needs to delete his photos. So I'm going to break his camera, and like it looked like he was basically ready to kick my ass. And then one of the pro government student protesters escorted me out, and I was like, "Did I do something wrong?" And he like was being a bit flighty about it. And I said, you know, he said it's better for your safety for you not to be here. So
That's
yeah,
probably true, actually.
yeah.
But tell me, what's the perception of Serbia? Because Serbia recently, the opinion polls put Serbia as the one country in Europe where Putin is the most popular politician. So they are really not ready for the European Union. And I'm always saying that it must be isolated, but maybe that's too much. But what's the perception of Serbia in Canada?
No real perception at all, right? I mean, we do have a large Serbian community, one of the largest in the world. I mean, obviously not at Austria's levels, but I think there are about maybe 60 to 80,000 of us, something like that. And they're mostly in Toronto. So like I grew up in the Serbian ghetto. I very naively as a child thought that 10% of Canada was Serbian. Yeah.
That's
But
a lot for
yeah,
millions.
yeah. But there really aren't that many of us, so people don't know. And the Serbian community is not very well organized. So when you look at, for example, the Jewish diaspora or the Armenian diaspora, um, they're really good at organizing and advocating for their wants and for their needs. but Serbians were quite atomized, and to the degree that we're politically organized, it's usually small scale stuff like organizing something small to raise money for the student protesters, but we don't really lobby in a concerted way, and so we are not on the agenda.
I want to say as well that Serbia is a fantastic country and there are many, many pro-European Serbs. Unfortunately, basically, Putin loves Serbia so much that he has basically occupied the political and economic control levels of the society in 2003. And that's the tragedy of that country, that unfortunately also in the mentality, many people have some whatever traditional links with Russia. And that, of course, now in the last 4 years has even intensified, and it's unfortunate. And I hope that Serbia finds also a way to the West.
Yeah. Well,
Please.
Well, the problem here is that there is still a deep sense of resentment against the bombing of Serbia by NATO in the late 90s over the Kosovo thing. The underlying issue is that for many Serbian nationalists, they do not think that Serbia did anything wrong in Kosovo. I obviously disagree. I've been in Kosovo. I've spoken with people who have cried when they remember the Serbian atrocities there. On the Serbian end, what they'll often do is they'll say, well, the Kosovar Albanians did horrible things to Serbians living there, which is true. We can't deny that. But they use that as an excuse to absolve themselves of any responsibility for the atrocities that they committed. And so, because they don't recognize that Serbians ethnically cleansed Kosovar Albanians, they think that NATO bombed Serbia for quote unquote no reason. And so they still hate NATO with a passion. When you go through Serbia, you see anti-NATO graffiti very often. And on the anniversary of the bombing, you will see, Serbians go out on the street to commemorate it. And you have youth who were not even alive at the time of the bombing. And they protest against Serbia with such passion that you would imagine that this bombing happened last year. The Serbians have cultivated this historical memory and amplified it to such a degree that they seem stuck in that past, and that keeps them in Russia's arms.
Adam, I was 4 years ago in 2022, I was for the 24th of March 2002 in Belgrade, and I called for Belgrade and Serbia to support Ukraine and to stop the airspace towards Russia, which unfortunately they still have open to this day. And I also said, and I always do this in Vienna as well, I said, thank you for the American bombs to have liberated Vienna in 1945, because we were not a part of a democratic regime change. We were part of a military intervention. It was called World War II, and it was very necessary. And thanks for all the Canadians who have liberated Europe as well. And that's basically from time to time necessary. If entrenched brutal tyrannies are there in Europe, it needs American and Canadian firepower to remove the Nazis and to remove Milosevic ultimately. And that's what I always say in Belgrade. It doesn't make me very popular in the Serbian media, unfortunately. But ultimately, I hope that one day the Serbs will also say thank you, like I say thank you, that America has liberated them from the tyranny of Milosevic. And until they say this, they will not be able to join the European Union, unfortunately, because without repentance for a past genocide, you cannot join the Western value community.
I think it might be asking a lot of them to express gratitude here. And I know that most of my family members would be deeply offended if I asked that, because it's different. These are people who remember being bombed in living time, right? And so, Gunther, I mean, I understand where you're coming from, but when you say, I say thank you to the bombing of 1945, the people who were bombed that time are pretty much all dead now. That memory is gone. But in Serbia, there are people who remember it. My aunt remembers the hunger that came with hyperinflation and sanctions. And so I think the most that we can ask for here is just for, hopefully, that Serbians will slowly forget about this and realize that the past is the past, and there's a different future forward where, by integrating with Europe, Serbia can become great and can become prosperous. But we need to be realistic about what we ask of Serbians when it comes to reckoning with historical memory.
We are now This was in 99 when NATO did the liberation. The Serbs call it the bombing. I say the liberation of Kosovo and the liberation ultimately of Serbia as well. We are now at the eve of other historic liberation campaign. It's of course not decided. We will see what happens tonight or tomorrow. But with all likelihood, what I read on Twitter the whole day, it's now the whole armada of the American firepower is in positioning. The Gerald Ford is also in Israel now, very close to where you are at the moment in the harbor of Tel Aviv. And so basically the decision for strike will fall this weekend or it will not come. So ultimately we are going to use military force again, ultimately for a humanitarian cause, because, we could also we could also wait 20 years and probably the Iranians will not attack us. So it's ultimately a regime change for humanitarian cause. Yeah? And this is now, of course, a big decision to make. And you see it in the case of Serbia, and that has lasting consequences. So what's your take? Not if it happens, but is it the right moral thing to intervene, to use American military power like in 45, like in 99?
Yeah, I think the moral case for dislodging the Islamic regime is unambiguous. And I think that if there was any uncertainty around it, that uncertainty evaporated after the regime slaughtered tens of thousands of its own citizens to stay in power. The Iranian diaspora is united in its support for regime change and military strikes. Of course, the diaspora is different from the people in Iran. It is one thing to advocate for strikes when you're outside the country versus when you're inside. But these diaspora voices have family members back home and they talk to their family members. So they do have some sense of what life is like in Iran. And it seems as if many Iranians support this as well. In fact, just before I spoke with you, I was interviewing another Iranian who is based in Israel. So we were doing a video call and I asked about the 12-day war. And he said, yeah, his family back in Iran didn't blame the Israelis, didn't blame the Americans, blamed the regime and wanted the regime gone. And that is what I'm hearing again and again when I speak with Iranians about their families back home. And so if the Iranian people want it inside Iran, outside Iran, if it benefits the United States, if it benefits, the West more broadly, if the only loser really is the regime, then why not? And the Israelis themselves are also willing to pay the cost of this counterstrike because they see this as being inevitable. But it is a bit of a scary time. I found that the 12-day war was fine. I was relaxed throughout most of it because I went to the shelter, but we don't know what to expect right now. And, I'm going to go to the shelter every single time because that's what you do and you are safe there. But I do sometimes, I worry about the prospect of being buried alive or dying. But that might be just me overthinking things. There are 10 million people here who are going through the exact same thing, and you just try to live normally while also being realistic about the risks.
On the other hand, Iran, since 50 years, calls for the destruction of Israel every single day. The children in the Iranian schools are shouting death to Israel and death to America every day in the morning. And so ultimately, if the Iranian regime is removed, it's possible, and I think so, worth the risk of the coming nights of fear in Tel Aviv, because ultimately Israel will live in freedom and in prosperity and removed from this permanent danger of a nuclear-armed Iran threatening Israel with destruction.
I do want to emphasize something, and I know we're running out of time, but this is a very, very important point to emphasize about the Iranian community. Iranians themselves broadly are not anti-Semites. In fact, they generally seem to feel very warm feelings towards the Israelis and towards Jews in general. So in the anti-regime protests that took over Toronto for January and February, one thing that I saw was that in every protest there were lots of Israeli flags. And I interviewed the people holding these flags. Some of them were Jews or Israelis who would come to show support. Some of them were Iranians who, realizing that the Jewish community was an ally, had come to show support, right? And no one harassed these people for carrying Israeli flags. And I would tell my Jewish friends, I myself am not Jewish, but I would tell my Jewish friends, you should come to these protests because ironically, the safest space to hold a Israeli flag in public is in the Iranian community here, right? And after October 7th in Canada, the Jewish community had very few allies, but the one ally that it could always rely on to support it was the Iranian diaspora. Iranians were always at the Jewish events saying, we stand with you because we together are co victims of this Islamic regime. And from what I hear from the Iranian community, the Iranians back in Iran, not all of them, but like most of them, seem to have no problem with Israel. There is this great and underreported bromance between the two. And when I interview Iranians, when I interview Israelis, they always talk about their shared ancient history. They talk about Cyrus the Great, who was a benevolent ancient king from, I think, 550 BC, and how he, in the process of conquering the ancient Near East, liberated the Jews from their captivity in Babylon and allowed them to go to Judea to build their second temple. And so, one of the greatest figures of Persian history liberated the Jews. The Jews are eternally grateful. And for Persians, they know that if they look to Cyrus the Great, they see that this is how they should react, how they should act towards the Jewish community.
Now, last Tuesday, when it was the 24th of February, we had a big demonstration of Ukrainians in front of the Austrian parliament, and they invited as well the Iranians, the Iranian opposition. And there was a real kind of a mutual enforcing support mechanism between the Ukrainians and the Iranians for freedom. And I think that's also a very important aspect. And there were a lot of Israeli flags at this demonstration as well. So this is the triangle of freedom and the kind of alliance of freedom which is now developing. I was unfortunately in the minority there because I had also the NATO flag wrapped around my body at this demonstration. And as you know, and this is also the last topic, then I leave you, but the situation is that Austria is still a neutral country. Canada is one of the biggest NATO powers. What's your opinion about Austrian immoral and anti-solidarity neutrality, which we somehow inherited and don't want to change? We don't deliver any weapons to Ukraine because of that. And what's your feeling towards Austrian neutrality? Are you in favor of ending that? And should Austria join NATO like Sweden and Finland?
I mean, I'm obviously against it. I think that it's spoiled, right? The Austrians get to enjoy their sovereignty because the countries around them contribute to this shared effort to defend the continent. Well, they get to say that it's not their problem, and obviously it's their problem, right? They are mooching off of the defense investments of their neighbors, right? And that's ridiculous. And then I'm also aware of the fact that the Austrian elite were partially co-opted by Russian money. So we know that that's a problem too. And I can't separate foreign policy from that scandal as well. So on my end, I would love to see Austria take a more mature and realistic approach when it comes to sovereignty and mutual defense. Because should Ukraine fall, should Russian troops, God forbid, take Kyiv and go all the way to Lviv, then Austrians will have no choice but to spend much more money on defense than they are right now, and they will rue the fact that they didn't do anything sooner.
Thanks a lot for your support for Austrian NATO membership. That's absolutely what I support as well. As you know me from X, I think you have seen already my tweets, yeah. And I want to make sure that Ukraine will never fall. Ukraine will win this war, and Ukraine will liberate Crimea, and we will all be victorious. And Canada and Europe will form a very strong alliance in the future for security, prosperity, and long live NATO. This is my last statement. I want to give you, Adam, first of all, thank you very much for coming to the show. Maybe some last statements, what you hope for tonight. I wish you safety, first of all. And I wish, of course, that the Americans liberate the Iranians. And I wish you a very exciting, but of course, secure weekend at these historic times in Tel Aviv.
Thank you. I mean, my closing message is that I hope that civilian casualties are as low as possible, both in Israel and in Iran. And I want us to think about the Israeli civilians who are scared, even if they keep this fear hidden. And I also want us to think about the Iranian civilians because the IRGC has spent so much money waging war, but they couldn't even be bothered to build shelters for their own people. So, whereas I can go to a shelter, the average Iranian cannot. So, let us keep them in mind too. And then the final message as an act of self promotion, you can please find me on X, TikTok, or Instagram or Facebook, Adam Zivo, ADAMZIV as in Victor, O, Adam Zivo on any of those platforms.
Thanks a lot for coming to the show. I will share on all your platforms and we will also do Instagram clips together. Thanks a lot. It was a very nice conversation. I wish you safety, security, and all the best in your courageous effort to report from the front lines of freedom in Ukraine and in Israel. And thanks a lot, Adam, for coming to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I stopped the live streaming now.